Hey guys, Scott here. Real quick video today. I want to talk about the killer power roll paradox that is in the community. Basically, how often do you hear that, killer should be seen as the power roll? It's a 1v4 game and, it's supposed to be a monstrous killer chasing some survivors that are just trying to survive. So the game should be sort of favored towards the killer. The killer should be the power roll. It's always a loosely defined thing. People don't really know exactly what they're talking about when they say power roll. If you try to say, so the game should be killer sided, it should be imbalanced towards killer, they say no, they should just be the threat or something. It's never really clearly defined what the power role is, but the general consensus from people that say that is that they believe killer should be more of a threat. They should be more perceived as a threat, and survivors are too strong for that to be considered the case, right? But the whole paradox I want to talk about, it's pretty simple. So when people say that killer is not the power role, it's supposed to be a scary, killer chasing survivors in like a horror game. Typically, when killer becomes noticeably weaker is at the higher level, right? So when you have very good survivors that know how to abuse most of the killers, obviously not all the killers, there are some killers that don't give a shit and can still win against everybody. But, if you're playing clown or something at a high level, yeah, you're going to have a scenario where the killer is not really going to feel like a power roll. They're not really going to feel strong. So once you do get to that high level, it's very apparent that the killer is not seen as like a super scary threat. But ironically, when you get to that high level, the whole game is not really perceived as a horror game anymore to begin with. You're not like, you're not new to the game. You're not getting scared. Once you've got like a couple hundred hours, it's not a horror game anymore. You're exposed to something scary long enough. It's not a horror game. So that whole, the killer is the power roll thing, they should be seen as like the horror icon threat, goes away at the same rate that you become less scared of the game and survivors start getting better at the game. Really, the only time that's the case, when people are making that argument that they should be seen as like a horror scary icon, is when people are newer to the game, when the argument doesn't work to begin with because the game is actually a little bit more killer sided towards that level of skill. So as that, it sort of goes up with it. As player skill goes up, the horror aspect of the game goes down, which means the whole making the killer the scary power roll doesn't matter as much because the game's not a horror game at that point anymore. So I just thought that's an interesting point. And there's a whole bunch of discussion to be had there, like whether or not it's okay that killer is harder to get to or killer skill is harder to achieve than survivor skill, because it is. I mean, there are simply just more things to learn about killer. Survivor, you just play the same survivor every single game. You do the same things, the pallets and windows. There's that learning to counter whatever killer's power you're going against, and that is a skill. But learning how to use the power of the killer is significantly harder than learning how to counter it, in my opinion. For example, you know what to do against a curve Billy in a loop, but learning how to do that as Hillbilly is significantly harder than knowing what to do against it. And there's a whole interesting discussion there, too. Might as well include this in this video, of whether or not that's okay that the killer is the harder role to play. See, the thing is, I think when you have a harder role like killer, it's okay, but it also can lead to perceptions of imbalance a lot more apparently. Because if you have a new player and a new player, one picks killer, one picks survivor, as they level up in skill at the same rate, the killer is going to perceive imbalances far more quickly than the survivor will. The survivor, it's a lot easier, I think, to learn. I do think it's about the same level to master, because there is a lot to master on survivor that people that disagree are probably just not that good at survivor. But I do think the rate at which you get better at survivor is significantly faster than the rate at which you get better at killer. So to a newer killer, it can immediately seem like, well, the game is quickly getting, out from under me, and survivor is going to be much stronger because it's simply just harder to learn killer. So, if you start at the same time, it'll seem like survivor is way stronger than killer. And this all kind of relates to Otz's whole thing where people were saying, okay, fine, if you have 8 bajillion hours in the game as killer, then you can finally do okay without perks and all that stuff. And it's interesting that they try to use that as a fulcrum for their balancing argument when I don't think it's necessarily related. Interesting discussion, because is the time it takes to learn something inherently related to how balanced the game actually is? And I feel like there's a yes and no to that, because it will people will perceive it to be more imbalanced because it takes significantly longer to get to that level as killer, and people just don't have the time to do that. So they'll probably never get to that point, and thus the game appears way less balanced than it actually is, because to expect that of everybody is kind of ridiculous. However, when you sort of compare everybody on the same level, like the strongest stuff Killer can bring and the strongest stuff a Survivor can bring, like a super sweaty Blight with a great build against super sweaty Survivors with great builds. The game actually kind of works, which is weird, but it takes way more to learn that Blight than it takes to learn that Spirit. So it's very readily apparent that, Survivor can seem way stronger. And I just thought that was like an interesting point, because that's people try to use that as like the base of their argument that Killer's harder to play. That means it's imbalanced, but I don't necessarily think that's true. I'm not saying the game's not imbalanced, because it is, absolutely, but I don't think that's a good argument for it. And frankly, I think it's okay. I made a video about this like a year or two ago. I think it's okay that Killer is harder than Survivor. I really, really do. And for even just for simple financial reasons, like there needs to be 4 times as many Survivors as Killers. So it's okay that the Killer role is a little bit harder. But the interesting thing is, it doesn't matter. Even if the game was perfectly balanced, the Killer side is still going to be harder. In an asymmetric game like this, you are still 100% of your team as a Killer. And that's always going to be more pressure on you. That's always going to be harder. I don't care how balanced the game is. That's always going to be the case. And, that kind of, I think, it rubs off the wrong way to a lot of people, saying that it's okay that Killer is a lot harder to play. But I don't think there's any avoiding that in an asymmetrical game. So I guess that is the main point I'm really trying to make there. But that's it. I just wanted to really talk about that whole paradox thing. I thought that was interesting, and follow up with a couple of other discussions. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. See you.